Hello everyone. Today we are going to start with the first chapter of Hornbill, that is a portrait of a lady by Khushwant Singh. Khushwant Singh was a very renowned writer. His famous book, The Train to Pakistan, and other than that, he has translated many works from the native language into English. He also held some very important posts such as ambassador and high commissioner. And he was a regular columnist uh, with No One with Malice. That was his regular feature in the important newspaper, The Times of India. Now, this chapter, Portrait of a Lady. Let us first understand what is the meaning of the word portrait. Portrait is a picture. So, this chapter is actually the picture of a lady. Picture not painted, but painted with color and brush, but painted with words. In this chapter, the author is talking about his grandmother, his relationship with his grandmother, and various other aspects. So let us start with the chapter. He says that his grandmother, like everybody's grandmother, was an old woman. Many of you surely must have the opportunity to be with your grandparents, and you must have observed that you have seen them in a particular physical state where you hardly find any change. Same thing is happening with the author. He says that his grandmother was old like everyone's grandmother. She had been old and wrinkled for 20 years that I had known her. People said that she had once been young and pretty and had even had a husband, but that was hard to believe. Now, generally, the children, what do when they look at their grandparents? They never think that they had once been young. Only when we look through the old photographs of our grandparents, then we come to know that okay, they looked different when they were younger. Same was the case with the author. Now his grandfather's portrait was hung over the mantelpiece in the drawing room. Now here he gives a description of his grandfather. He wore a big turban and loose-fitting clothes. His long white beard covered the best part of his chest, and he looked at least 100 years old. He did not look the sort of a person who would have a wife or a child. Whenever he looked at the portrait of his grandfather, he always had a feeling that he must have been 100 years old. And naturally, for a child, an old man is an old man. An old man can only be grandfather. He can never be a father, a husband, or have children. And so author says he looked as if he could only have lots and lots of grandchildren. And then, as people say, that as for my grandmother being young and pretty, the thought was almost revolting. How could she ever be young? She is so old, wrinkled. And that's why it was a thing which was not accepted. Now, sometimes grandmother used to tell these children stories about her own childhood, the games she played during that time. Now, that was also very difficult to believe because how could an old woman uh, climb on the trees or jump like little children or something like that? And that's why author says that seemed quite absurd and undignified on her part, and we treated it like the fables of the prophets she used to tell. So they just felt that she was telling some imaginary story from her own memory. Now this particular paragraph, here author gives us a picture of his grandmother. Now I'll advise for a moment everyone, just close your eyes and listen just to the description. She, has, she had always been short and fat and slightly bent. Her face was a crisscross of wrinkles running from everywhere to everywhere. No, we were certain she had always been as we had known her, old, so terribly old that she could not have grown older and had stayed at the same age for 20 years. She could never have been pretty, but she was always beautiful. She hobbled about the house in spotless white, with one hand resting on her waist to balance her stoop and the other telling the beads of her rosary. Her silver locks were scattered untidily over her pale, puckered face, and her lips constantly moved in inaudible prayer. Yes, she was beautiful. She was like the winter landscape in the mountains, an expanse of pure white serenity, breathing peace and contentment. Now, just think of this description which has been given by the author. If we just close our eyes and listen to this, we form a picture in our mind, a picture of someone moving about in the house in spotless white dress, silver locks scattered over wrinkled face, puckered face, wrinkled face, bent, one hand supporting her stoop, other hand telling the beads of the rosary. Now that is a picture which is formed. Now this is an art. This is an art, and this is known as factual description. Through words, we present a picture of a place, a person, or a thing, and we create a picture in the mind of someone who is listening or reading. That is what is known as factual description. And through this description, we come to know about grandmother, that she was short, fat, bent, face full of wrinkles, always in white, spotless white, uh, grey hair, silver locks spread all over her face, one hand telling the beads of the rosary, other hand supporting the stoop. Author says that, okay, about being pretty, he was not sure, but he says she was certainly beautiful. Now don't be confused between these two words, pretty and beautiful. Pretty signifies physical beauty, whereas beautiful is the inner beauty, and that's what he feels like. Because when he looked at her, what he felt, as if he was looking at the winter landscape in the mountains, everywhere covered with snow, complete peace and contentment, satisfaction. That is what he talks about his grandmother. Now, author says that he and his grandmother were very good friends. Now, what so happened that his parents went to city and they had not quite settled over there, so they had left author with the grandmother. Now, this is the first phase of the relationship of author with his grandmother. She used to wake me up in the morning and get me ready for school. She said her morning prayer in a monotonous sing-song while she bathed and dressed me in the hope that I would listen and get to know it by heart. I listened because I loved her voice but never bothered to learn it. Then she would fetch my wooden slate, which she had already washed and plastered with yellow chalk, a tiny earthen ink pot, and a red pen, tie them all in a bundle, and hand it to me. After a breakfast of a thick, stale chapati with a little butter and sugar spread on it, we went to school. She carried several stale chapatis with her for the village dogs. So this was, if the question comes, what was the daily routine of grandmother and author while they were in village? And this is actually the first, there are a few other phases which we will come to know in the chapter. This was the first phase when author was living with his grandmother in village. And she was the one who used to get him ready for the school and all that. And she used to accompany him to the school. She always went to school with him because the school was attached to the temple, while the priest taught them alphabets and all that, and prayers and scriptures. She was sitting there in the temple reading her own scriptures. When both of them had completed their work, they would walk together. Now, grandmother always used to carry the remaining stale chapatis. Now, while returning from temple or the school to their home, to their house, she used to just break those chapatis and throw at the dogs who would be following them. So this was the routine of Arthur while he was in village with his grandmother, where he was very close to her. Now when the parents were settled comfortably, they called for them, and Arthur says, that was a turning point in our friendship. Turning point means the things now took a different direction. It was a point where some important change happened. Now in the city, they were sharing the same room, but grandmother was no more accompanying him to school because he went to an English school in a motor bus. As there were no dogs in the street, she took to feeding sparrows in the courtyard of the city house. As the years rolled by, now less of communication started happening. Poet author says we saw less of each other. Now, as it was routine of her in the village, so similarly she continued with it in the city also. Woke him up, got him ready for school. Whenever he came back from the school, she asked about various things, what he had been taught, and then author would tell her English words, things of Western science, law of gravity, Archimedes principle, world being round, etc. Now, all this thing made her very unhappy. One of the major reasons was that she could no longer help him in his lessons. And secondly, she did not believe in the things that were taught in the school. And moreover, she was unhappy that there was no teaching about God and scriptures in the school where Arthur went. Now one day when Arthur came back from school, he announced that music lessons were given. She was very much disturbed. Why she was disturbed? Because to her, music had lewd associations, very low graded associations. According to her, it was the monopoly of harlots and beggars. Harlots, the women who make their living by singing songs or something like that. And for beggars. She felt that it was not for the gentle folk. But she said nothing, and her silence meant that she did not like it. After that, she rarely talked to Arthur. Now when Arthur went to university, he was given a room of his own. Till now they were sharing the same room. But now Arthur had a separate room, and that's why Arthur says the common link of friendship was snapped. What was the common link of friendship? Though there was hardly, not so much of conversation now, no more of talking to each other, but still there was something common, and that common thing was the room which they were sharing. And now he was given a separate room, and author says the common link of friendship was snapped. But grandmother did not say anything about it. She just accepted her seclusion. Now most of her time was spent with her spinning wheel. From sunrise to sunset, she sat by the spinning wheel reciting her prayers. It was only during the afternoon that she relaxed for a while, and that was the time when she fed the sparrows. While she sat in the veranda breaking the bread into little bits, hundreds of little birds collected round her, creating a veritable bedlam of chirruping, veritable bedlam, too much of noise, all sorts of birds sitting over there. Some came and perched on her legs, others on her shoulders, some sat on her head, some sat on her shoulders, some sat on her head or on the leg. She smiled, but she never shooed them away. She did not, what you can say, in any way in her action, try to remove them from her body. And author says this was the happiest half hour of the day for her. Now, this particular thing you can say also as that this was a routine of grandmother while she was in city. Now, after the university education was completed, author decided to go abroad for further studies, and he was sure that grandmother would be very upset because he would be away for 5 years. And at her age, she was so old, you could never tell. At a certain point in life, after a certain age, we become quite uncertain about the person, whether the person would be there or not. But grandmother did not say anything. She was not even sentimental. She came to see him off at the railway station, did not talk or show any emotion. Her lips moved in prayer. Her mind was lost in prayer. Her fingers were busy telling the beads of her rosary. Silently, she kissed my forehead, and Arthur cherished that moist imprint, thinking that perhaps it was the last sign of physical contact between them. But that was not so. Because when Arthur came back after 5 years, grandmother was at the station to receive him. And she looked the same, not a day older. Still, she had no words. When she hugged him, clasped him in her arms, Otto could listen, hear the prayers that she was reciting at that moment. Otto says that he had come after 5 years, but then also, that on that day also, her best half an hour was while she was feeding the sparrows, and Otto says she fed them a little longer that day. But in the evening, a sudden change came. Usually she used to pray in evening, but that day she did not pray. She collected the women of the neighborhood, took got an old drum and started to sing. For several hours she thumped the sagging, loose skins of the dilapidated and not in a good condition drum and sang of the homecoming of warriors. She went on. Arthur and his family had to persuade her to stop so that she could not overstrain herself. And Arthur says that was the first time since he had known her that she did not pray. For the first time, he saw that grandmother did not pray in the evening. The next morning, she was taken ill. It was a mild fever, and the doctor told us that it would go. But my grandmother thought differently. She told us that her end was near. Though the doctor said that it was only a mild fever because of overstraining and all that, but grandmother had different ideas. And she said that she missed out on the prayer the previous day. She does not want to be disturbed at the last moment of her life, and she wanted to spend whatever time was left with her in praying. Everyone protested, but she ignored. She lay peacefully in bed, praying and telling her beads. And even before anyone could suspect, her lips stopped moving and the rosary fell from her lifeless fingers. A peaceful pallor spread on her face, and we knew that she was dead. So grandmother had some premonition that her end has come, and that's why she asked everyone not to disturb. And before anyone could understand, she silently passed away into another world. We lifted her off the bed as it is customary, laid her on the ground and covered her with red shroud. After a few hours of mourning, we left her alone to make arrangements for her funeral. In the evening, we went to her room with a crude stretcher to take her to be cremated. The sun was setting and had lit her room and veranda with a blaze of golden light. We stopped halfway in the courtyard. All over the veranda and in her room, right up to where she lay dead and stiff, wrapped in the red shroud, thousands of sparrows sat scattered on the floor. There was no chirruping. We felt sorry for the birds, and my mother fetched some bread for them. She broke it into little crumbs, the way my grandmother used to, and threw it to them. The sparrows took no notice of the bread. When we carried my grandmother's corpse off, They flew away quietly. Next morning, the sweepers swept the breadcrumbs into the dustbin. When they came back, making all the arrangements for cremation, they saw a scene. And what was that scene? That scene was that thousands of sparrows were surrounding the grandmother's corpse. But they were not chirruping at all. There was no noise, no sound at all. Earlier, when grandmother used to feed them, there used to be bedlam, too much of noise. But right now, there was no noise. All the sparrows were sitting silently. Arthur's mother felt sorry for them because today there was no one to give them bread. So she took some bread from the kitchen, broke them into little crumbs as grandmother used to, and threw at the sparrows. But the sparrows did not take any notice of it. And when they lifted away the body and took her away for cremation, all the sparrows flew away silently. Now, what does this show? This shows that even animals and birds, they can also understand a feeling of loss. Now, there was a bond of love established between grandmother and the sparrows. And sparrows not chirruping, not paying attention to the breadcrumbs thrown to them signifies that they also felt that they had lost someone very dear and very close. Now, this is all about the chapter. Thank you.